All right, yeah. So some of the feedback I'd had was predictable, right? Like they were saying things like that there was a lot of time spent at the beginning on some kind of tangential issues, and then when it got to the like real meat, the bit that I guess most people were tuning in for, which was like the spar over whether or not the argument shows that God exists or whatever, that there was like it was too brief at that point. And I think that that was because it's really easy to get sort of bogged down in preliminary like ground clearing stuff, isn't it? And then you realize, oh, we've only got like 10 minutes left. You've got to do the whole argument.
Well, there are other considerations too. So in the background, when we agreed to do this, I said, let's do something where we agree a bit and that we haven't, that hasn't been done to death. And Bill and Cameron said, well, what about the Wigner article? What about talking about Wigner's claim? And I said, oh, I don't know that I could talk about that for an hour and a half. And so then they said, okay, well, let's just make it on that particular argument, but we're kind of focusing on what Wigner says. And so Bill and I both prepared to talk about Wigner. And that's why the thing had the rather strange flavour that it did, because we had kind of originally thought that that was what we would talk about. And if we got to the argument, well, we got to the argument. And if we didn't, we didn't.
Right.
So it was kind of a failure on our part to really think through what we should be talking about. That led it to have that kind of strange flavour.
Yeah, and the time constraints. I mean, it's fair enough. Cameron's like, it's kind of a business for him. That's how he lives. And so he has to take those super chats because I don't know if you know how that works, but super chats have like cash values attached to them. So people have paid to have those questions put. So he kind of has to get to them because that's how the business model works. So even though on some level you kind of just want to see the two experts like have at it, he's got to have people chipping in with questions. So I don't know. It builds engagement, so the audience like interacts with the people. So yeah, it makes sense, I suppose. But
so part of the problem then is that the initial discussion wasn't focused on the argument that was to come. Instead, Bill had formulated a different argument, which was what he thought Wigner was arguing. And I mean, you could argue there's a discussion to be had about whether it kind of does justice to Wigner or not. But then we started talking about the first premise in that argument, in fact, the first half of the first premise. And that conversation could have kept on going for a lot longer than it did.
Yeah.
That was the problem, because that was not what people were expecting.
No, I talked to Bill like a few weeks beforehand. I don't know if you saw any of that conversation, but he and I talked about the Kalam on Cameron's channel. And I could have just paused and talked about whether his notion of the potential infinite and Aristotle's notion were actually the same thing. And I mean, because it seems to me that Craig has this weird like complaint that Aristotle and Aquinas both like just mistook, because they both think that the past had no beginning, but that it's potentially infinite, right? Because it seems to me that Aristotle is quite clear that the potential infinite just means like spread out over time, basically, and it's something that's infinite, but it's never infinite at any one point in time. So that obviously just allows you to have an infinite past and just classify that as potentially infinite. But Craig seemed to think that Aristotle mistakes his own definition and applies it to the past, and it's a kind of blunder or something. But that just seems to me that Craig is applying Craig's definition to what Aristotle says about the infinite past, and then comes to the conclusion that Aristotle's made a mistake. So I could have spent ages talking to him about that, but the whole point of the discussion, so we probably did spend 10-15 minutes skirting around that issue at the beginning before, and then Cameron was like, right, we're gonna have to move on now, and I was like, whoa, hold on, we haven't even talked about the actual Kalam yet. This is all ground clearing. So yeah, I totally understand that, the tendency to waste time at the beginning. All right, so do you want to go through Craig's premises a bit? That seemed to be one way of looking at this, where I could give you the opportunity to say more about some of those if you did want to.
So I could say something about the argument, but I don't think the argument is the most interesting thing to talk about. But let's start with the argument. So, I mean, his argument for the conclusion that God exists, the one that goes, if God doesn't exist, the applicability of mathematics to the physical world is just an unexplained contingency. I'll put it that way. I mean, he says happy coincidence, but that's not the most felicitous way to put it. The application of mathematics to the physical world is not just an unexplained contingency, so God exists.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, one of the things about this argument is that, at least from Bill's point of view, it's necessary that God exists. So that conditional in the first premise has an antecedent that by his lights is impossible. Right. So then I think it doesn't matter. You can have your argument. It doesn't matter whether the applicability of mathematics to the physical world is or is not just a brute contingency. Slot whichever one of them you think is not true into the first premise, put the other one in the second premise, and you'll get out the conclusion that God exists. Right? And that's not a very satisfactory state of affairs. I mean, there are other reasons for not really feeling very satisfied with the argument as something to discuss, but maybe that will do. What's really interesting is the question whether, if you think about a certain kind of theist and a certain kind of naturalist, one of them has a better explanation of the applicability of mathematics to the physical world, assuming that there's actually something there that, as Bill said, cries out for explanation, because that's a separate issue. But assuming that there is, then the question, the right way to frame it, according to me, is just to say, well, who's got the better explanation? So let's look at the explanations in some detail, see what they say, and then see if we can reach some judgment about who's got the better one.
Yeah, right. So then what you're doing is a kind of like a rational theory choice kind of thing, like evaluating the merits, the virtues, or whatever, the virtues and vices of the different theories and picking the one that kind of wins in that game.
Yeah, or maybe agreeing that it's just a draw, right?
Yeah.
Which theory is better is determined elsewhere. It's not determined here, not even in part, right? I mean, it just depends how the assessment goes.
Yes, right. So not every like battle that you could fight along those terms that might have a winner, like which theory best accounts for this mug being here or something. You might say, well, it's just favoured slightly by naturalism, but that doesn't mean that you pick naturalism as your like worldview just because of this one. Consider that's kind of irrelevant, right? You need to think about everything, or at least more important things than that.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a bunch of things that lots of people recognise are relevant to this choice between naturalism and theism, and you should consider all of them together when you're kind of doing this weighing up, I think.
I suppose so that, I mean, you might say that the applicability of mathematics to the world, which I guess we could just call like the fact that the world is ordered. I mean, I'm not sure if it's basically just the same thing, right? But that is quite significant. And, you know, I kind of feel like the fact that consciousness exists or something, and the fact that like the world is ordered, that those types of like, they seem really deep, significant facts that require some kind of attempt at explanation, unlike my mug thing. It does, at least I agree, you know, that it's a significant question that requires attention, right?
So there are some other things that you might talk about, like the fine tuning, and you might wonder whether once you've talked about that, you've already said enough to cover the order question.
Yeah. Okay. Right? Yeah.
But I agree that, you know, why is there something rather than nothing? There's the fine tuning. There's consciousness, right? There's some questions about ethics. I mean, there's a bunch of things, religious experience. There's lots of things you can talk about, and you might think that there's one topic here that's just going to settle the matter because one theory does so well on it and the other one does so badly. But that would have to be demonstrated, right? And at the beginning, you can't rule out we better consider it all and then see which one's doing better.
Yeah, right. Okay, so look, I found as the conversation went on that I thought, I mean, I read that Vigna paper when I was um, I guess when I was doing my PhD or something, but years ago, like 10 years ago or
Yeah.
something. And I figured I'm familiar enough with the general gist of that argument. Right? It's kind of sunk into my brain to some extent. But then as you guys were talking about it, I felt like my grip on it was like melting away. And I was starting to think, hold on, have I misunderstood this the whole time? Like, I think I'd had the idea that it was just, look, the world is um, ordered in such a way that there's a true mathematical description of it. And we pick that out with our successful mathematical theories, the ones that we apply to the world that do stuff, that make successful predictions. And I just kind of like assumed, well, that's the argument, right? But then as you were talking about it, it seemed to be that I think you posed it to him and you said something about like, well, is this a kind of Pythagorean idea, right? That everything is number and blah blah blah, and this is like the structure of the world. And Bill came back saying, well, it's kind of that, but it's also that structures that couldn't be instantiated in the world, like infinite dimensional Hilbert spaces or whatever, the fact that they're useful, right? That's also, and so it made me think, yeah, it's kind of obvious, but I guess I'd forgotten that. But it made me think then that it's much more difficult to evaluate. Like, what are we supposed to be saying um, that comparing theism and naturalism, that there's some clear winner there, that God would make the world such that infinite dimensional Hilbert spaces would be used in quantum mechanics. I mean, is that right?
Would be useful for human
Useful?
beings. I mean, because this is another thing. Is it the fact that we can use mathematics, or is it the fact that mathematics fits the world, right? Because that we can use infinite dimensional Hilbert spaces to make a bunch of empirical predictions using a theory that quite possibly isn't true.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's a weird example, isn't it? It's like it's a really messy theory, and it's one that like really super difficult to come up with. Not like it's not like a sort of elegant Newtonian mechanics or something. I mean, maybe Dirac thinks it's beautiful or something, but I mean, nobody else does. It's a weird, a counterintuitive theory that nobody really understands.
And that's right. And lots of people have complained about parts of the theory, like Feynman's sort of formulation of quantum electrodynamics. Lots of people didn't like it because it was so ugly. I mean, it just gave fantastically accurate results, but according to people at the time, it was not a beautiful theory.
Right. So this aspect of the argument that seems to rely on aesthetics doesn't fit that well with some of the examples that are given, right? Like that one in particular. And when you said to Bill something, I mean, this beginning bit that took so much time in the debate, you were basically saying, well, I don't know if it's aesthetics, right? I think it's more like a problem solving that's motivating the mathematician. And then Bill was like, oh, well, that's just part of what he means by aesthetic. So then I'm thinking, well, hold on, it's just if that's what you mean, then it's not. It's that mathematical theories arise from aesthetic, like with an asterisk or something, by which we also mean like the ability to solve practical problems or something. And then that doesn't seem so surprising, right? If that's the impulse that's driving mathematical development, problem solving, and it's not that surprising that we'd apply it to the world to solve problems, to do stuff with, right? That kind of makes it seem almost like trivial then, if you think about it like that.
And it's also the case that once you start thinking about it that way, that it's pretty hard to imagine how it could be that there was no application of mathematics to the world, right? Nothing to count, for example, right? So what's the world like if there's nothing to count in it and nothing to measure, right? So you can't.
Well, I was trying to imagine that. I mean, so I think I have two different possibilities. I mean, I'm not sure these work really in the end, but maybe imagine that. Imagine you like some radically different form of life that's like cloud based or something, right? Like if that's possible, some kind of cloud achieves consciousness by some process.
Like
right?
Fred Hoyle's interstellar cloud of
gas.
Okay.
Yeah. But imagine it's conscious, yeah, but it's got no like definite physical like boundaries or something. And maybe you can have a kind of weird community of them, like I don't know, in Jupiter or something, where there's just nothing solid at all. And maybe would they not be able to count? Would they develop like like continuous functions before discrete ones? I don't know. Maybe they would. Like, would that be how they approached mathematics? Maybe.
Oh no, the
I don't
first
know.
thing that comes to mind is the kind of many but almost one problem. So it depends how they count. If they count by almost identity, then they'll have no problems, right?
Okay. All right. And then here's another example. I mean, could you imagine? I'm thinking of like a kind of Disney film, like Fantasia or something, where stuff is just super weird and magical or whatever. And like maybe, and you know, in some sense, that's a possible world, I guess. But like, uh, can you imagine like whenever, like, I don't know, Dorothy or whatever puts two apples down and counts them, there's a third one somehow. You know, she just looks back and there's, oh shit, there's a third one, right? Like, or there's just one now, even though I put two down or something. And then could counting be systematically different like that somehow in a
It,
different world? Or,
yeah, it's interesting because the way you described it assumes some counting, like she puts
well,
down one, right? And so it seems like once you're thinking about there being a sequence and you can kind of do slices on the world, maybe the actors can't, but surely from a kind of God's eye perspective, you can count the things that are there in each of the slices. And if there's this weird fissioning and fusing and whatever going on, that just makes it a complicated world. It doesn't mean that mathematics won't apply to it, at least
yeah,
things like arithmetic. It's, and I mean, after what you said in the Facebook Messenger post, I thought about this a little bit, and I'm going to struggle, I think, to
hmm
kind of imagine a scenario where you can't make significant application of mathematics. And maybe though, what Vigner or Craig will say is what I really cared about was the laws. This is another part of the conversation that didn't get explored at all. Sometimes what Vigner seems to be emphasizing is that there are these nice, neat, maybe beautiful mathematical laws that are part of what we use when we're explaining or predicting stuff. And maybe you can imagine a lawless world more easily than you can imagine one where you can't even count things.
Right. That seems a bit more. But even still, I think that you probably have some kind of like dynamic going on anyway. I mean, even if stuff's kind of the laws are changing, I kind of feel like, well, there'll be some true description of what's going on, right? Like
Yeah,
if
yeah,
cannonballs fall at different rates, then you could just say
yeah.
this is how that rate is varied over time, and that's the law or something.
Right. So there's periodically there was speculation about whether G in Newton's law is variable, whether it's
Right.
whether it's really a constant or whether it changes over time. That wouldn't have made any difference to its being a law, I
hmm
guess. So
Right. And I think that if on, I mean, I'm not a physicist, right? But friends who've tried to explain stuff to me in the past who were, and I think on some models of like when you rewind stuff back towards the Big Bang, then you find that like there's like four forces, but there's a point where they kind of meld into two, and then even if you go back further, there's just one, and so what the laws are kind of is variable in some way and those conditions, right?
right. So what's it called? There's a is it that you have a kind of phase transition or state transition or something and the values get set, but they could have been set differently. It's just that once they're set, then they apply unless you have another state transition or phase transition for the whole universe. So maybe G could have had a different value, but it just got assigned the particular value that it's got at a certain point. That wasn't right back at the beginning of the universe. It was
hmm
at a subsequent time in history when the forces separated, right? That was
Yeah,
this was the event where that happened. I've read things like that too, right? And it could
yeah,
be like that for all I know, right? I don't know whether it could be like that sort of metaphysically, but for all I know, it could be like that.
yeah. Right. So the point of this speculation, just I guess, because just to try and put some context on this, um, I think I was trying to say something to you in our Facebook chat about like how. So it seemed to me there was some kind of like lottery thing or a raffle thing, right? Like if you can say like, look, there's some big mystery about why. You might think there's some mystery about why is the universe ordered at all, right? Like it seemed like maybe if you think that it could be radically unordered, like the type of things we were just thinking about, like mathematics didn't apply at all, or in a different way, or something. Um, then there's some mystery about why it applies at all. But if you were able to show somehow a priori that there had to be some order that applied to the world, and the question was just which order applies, then it's more like saying, well, somebody has to win the lottery, right? And then you've got this mystery of like, well, why was it Graham that won the lottery? That's still surprising, but it's like less surprising than, given that somebody's got to win, it's like you've diffused a lot of the mystery out of it. It's just a question of who. So, and if that was right, then, if it didn't make sense for mathematics not to apply to the world somehow, which, I mean, it seems to me that could be right. Like there's some kind of category error in thinking that it couldn't apply, right? Then the bigger mystery is kind of like senseless, and it's just the sort of the more the less mysterious mystery of like, why does this specific mathematical theory apply in our case? So that seemed to me one way of like diffusing some of the mystery in this.
So that could be right. You might be able to go further too if you somehow thought that there are many universes and the different bits of the mathematics apply in different cases, right? I mean, then the winning the lottery doesn't look at all surprising, even if those other universes are ones where there aren't observers to apply the mathematics. Right? Yeah.
So then it feels like this just is the fine-tuning argument. Now, I'm not really sure what's different about this argument and fine-tuning.
Yeah, I'm worried about that too. But I did also say back at the beginning that there is this suspicion that if you've sorted out what to say about the fine-tuning, it might just sort out for you what to say about this argument as well.
Okay, so if that's right, then, I mean, I wonder, so your way of looking at it was, as you put it, doing metaphysics, right? So you're like comparing theories and seeing which one has the right virtues and blah, blah, blah. And none of that's straightforwardly epistemic, right? But yeah, I guess you could put it, and then traditionally, well, there are ways of stating a fine-tuning argument that are epistemic, right? So you could talk about like what the expectation would be given naturalism, that you would see this type of universe, versus the expectation given theism that you'd see this type of universe. And it seems like you could do the same thing here, right? Like, given naturalism, would you expect to see mathematical regularities or whatever? Would you expect to see, let's state the idea clearly. So would you expect to see, I suppose, a universe where lots of different mathematical theories have application? I think that's the gist once you take out the Pythagorean stuff. It's just that it's versatile. Lots of different mathematical theories apply. Would that be expected on naturalism more or less than on theism? Right. So do you think that makes a difference to the way the argument is stated?
I'm not sure. I do have one more preliminary question, which is about the notion of applicability, and in particular, the idea that somehow or other it's the amazing fit that's the thing that requires explanation, and that one's kind of odd unless you've got a metric of some kind, so right. and some bounds, and we have none of that in this conversation. So there's a fit, right? And what we do know is that kind of over time we get theories that seem to make better fit, but we don't have much idea about what's the lower end to how closely you can fit, because that depends a bit on how closely you can measure, right? And so I'm not sure whether this is also a worry that we should have discussed that we didn't, right, in the discussion, right? But Bill wanted to say it's amazing, it's astonishing, because the fit is so unbelievable. But maybe
Mm.
that's not right either. I'm not sure.
Well, I think you did bring this up because you talked about so Dirac predicted the positron, but he also
Yeah,
predicted the monopole, right?
yeah,
And it doesn't seem like there's a failure rate that we're not taking
yeah.
into account.
Yeah, I think that's a slightly different point, but it's still,
Oh, okay.
um, and I'm thinking that just because kind of using the units that some sort of standard units, we get predictions out of quantum electrodynamics that are accurate to 7 significant figures, right?
Hmm.
Well, what's so great about 7 significant figures if we could get 42 or
Hmm.
97 or 300 and, whatever, right? Why is that so astonishing?
Yeah, right. Okay, so I see the difference, right? So then you have to, I imagine. I mean, so now we're coming back to the fine tuning again, but I think you'd have to say something like, well, that level of fit 7 orders of magnitude or whatever,
Yeah.
um, would that be expected on the other alternative
Yeah.
hypothesis? You'd have to frame it in some kind of
Yeah,
epistemic sense.
but how are we going to assess that, right?
Yeah.
Right. That was the. I, and what
Mm.
level of how many significant figures or levels of magnitude are you going to expect on theism? I mean, I just don't. I mean,
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
goes back to the whole. I mean, a bit like you. I'd read the Wigner paper a long time ago, and I hadn't come back to it. And when I read it, I found myself asking myself questions and finding the whole thing quite slippery to get a handle on. So anyway, sorry, that was slightly a detour from where we were at.
No, that's all good. So, I mean, I think this conversation is going to be entirely detours, so that's fine. Um, okay, so look, I think that so if we look at the comparing, so the most interesting bit of the discussion that you had the other day was crammed in right before the questions and actually sort of distributed over the questions because you came
Yes.
back to it. Um, and I think so. I have a couple of things I wanted to ask you about that, but I wonder if you how would you, so let me give you the opportunity to state your naturalist hypothesis a bit more clearly, and you can take as long as you like to explain that. And then maybe if you want to contrast that with how you see Craig's theistic alternative explanation, and you spend as long as you like explaining that too.
Well, I guess there are two options for the naturalist. So one option is just going to say, you know what, this is a brute contingency, an
Hmm.
unexplained contingency.
Yeah.
It could have been that you didn't have this unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, but you do. That means in my theory, I've got brute contingency at a certain point. Now, that Bill and some theists like him say, I can remove that brute contingency, right? God wanted the world to be that way.
Hmm.
But there's another brute contingency that turns up in their theory because they can't think that it was necessary that God did this. Otherwise, they wouldn't, well, I'll come to that in a minute, right? There's another side to the naturalist story, right? But Bill doesn't want to say that. He wants to say, no, just as the naturalist was offering no explanation why we get a world in which we have this as opposed to one where we don't, the theist has nothing to say about why did God choose to have the world in which we've got it rather than the one in which we didn't.
Hmm.
Right? In both of the theories, there's a brute contingency, and everything that's kind of downstream depends upon the brute contingency.
Yeah.
Right? Now, what's the theoretical advantage in shifting the brute contingency back a little bit and adding some extra ontology? Right? It looks as though that's just theoretical loss. Right?
Yeah.
At least there's an argument that has to be had about why, especially if we abstract from any other considerations, why that's a good move for the theist to make. It just
Hmm.
doesn't look like it's a good move. Sure, the theist now has an explanation of the particular thing that the naturalist says is a brute contingency. That's not in dispute. The question is there some other brute contingency that's doing exactly the same kind of work, just a little bit further back in the theist theory?
Yeah.
Right? It's important to remember that that's what the point is. It's like, an analogy I often use for different cases like this. Some people worry, imagine people worrying about the fact that the Earth just hangs there in space, right? So we postulate that there's an elephant that the Earth's sitting on, and that's why the Earth doesn't fall, right? That theory is pure loss, because the same question arises for the elephant, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we've got no further forwards. Now, it's not exactly like that in this case, because the contingency is located in a different place, but it's not clear that it's any better having the contingency resting there. We're supposing that the naturalist is supposing there's all these different kinds of worlds, and some of them mathematics is unreasonably effective, and presumably lots it's not. And the theist is thinking God could have made all those worlds, right? And there's nothing that explains, just as there's nothing for the naturalist that explains why we got one of the ones where it's effective as opposed to all those ones where it didn't. There's nothing that explains why God made a world in which it's effective rather than one that there wasn't, because there's nothing to appeal to make the explanation, right? At some point, even if I haven't located it in exactly the right place, there's a brute contingency in the theist theory. There has to be, right? If the theist is going to suppose that these are all possible worlds. So as long as we're thinking that there's the same possibilities, it doesn't look like there's an advantage, right, in shifting the unexplained contingency back. That's what the naturalist will say. So if you think about it from the standpoint of the theories, the naturalist is not losing here, if that's the way we go. The other way we can go is, I just offered it to the theist, say instead that God had to. It's necessary that God makes the world where mathematics is unreasonably effective. Well, then I think there's a corresponding naturalist view here as well, which is just it had to be that way. That's why, right? Now, that might sound like an odd thing for naturalists to say, particularly, but it might sound odd for the theist too, particularly if you've got views about God's omnipotence and the kind of unconstrained. But for the naturalist, you might think, I can conceive of these other worlds. I can imagine them. Surely there's some sense in which they're possible. To which I say, well, you've got to have the right view about modality here. You've got to have a kind of view of modality that's quite similar in some ways, but only in some ways, to the kind of view that, say, Aquinas or Aristotle had, where every world shares some history with the actual world, and then you get divergence because chances play out differently. If that's the view that you've got, you get for free that the initial state is necessary, and whatever exists in the initial state exists of necessity, so long as there's an initial state.
Right. Okay. So I have some questions on that, but I'll come back to it.
Actualism will drive you there. It won't do that if you've got infinite regress, but I didn't bring that into this discussion because Bill's not interested in countenancing that as a possibility.
No,
right? So I'm happy to have that just ruled out for the purposes of this discussion. So, so we're supposing that there's an initial point, right? If every world shares a history with the actual world, that initial point just falls out. It's necessary, right?
Yeah.
And now the next bit is just it is the case that mathematics is unreasonably effective in the initial point, and and that feature's conserved, right? There's nothing that suddenly makes mathematics. If mathematics is effective, it's it doesn't, the efficacy doesn't disappear as the causal evolution goes on. So it had to be. It just falls out of the view that it had to be the case. Now, Bill was very unhappy with this. He didn't think that should count as an explanation.
Yeah.
It doesn't look, in certain respects, like an explanation in the way that God wanted it to be that way. It looks like an explanation, but it is an explanation. It does everything that you need. Why was it so? Because it had to be. What better explanation could there be, right?
Okay,
so
good.
That's the view.
Right. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of things. I mean, I guess on the one hand, yeah, Bill's view is the traditional one where God's exercising a free choice, right?
Yeah.
Um, it does feel like not quite such a dead end to think that God didn't exercise a free choice, but was compelled to do so. Because you could say something like, maybe his nature is such that this is the best of all possible worlds, and he's so good that he couldn't have done anything but this, right? That
So
sort of Leibnizian way of looking
right,
at it, maybe, right? That
that
seems like it's kind of plausible.
that will lead to modal collapse though, because there is only from Leibniz there is
Yeah,
only one possible world.
that's right. Yeah,
And so
that's right.
now, it why is it effective? Well, it couldn't have been otherwise.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
right. Every question is answered in the same way. Yeah.
it's necessary, right? So you don't want to go that. I mean, Bill won't want to go that way, and he shouldn't. Well, unless he's happy with Leibniz's view.
No, no, he's
Right.
not. But I just seem to me that
Sure.
there kind of is at least a coherent theistic story you could
Yeah.
tell about that. You just have to be okay with the
Uh,
consequence.
so I'm not thinking that it's incoherent. I'm just thinking that compare that with the comparable naturalist view, where determinism rules and there's only one possible initial state, right?
Mm,
We either way we have the explanation. We don't need God. That's a kind of extra bit in the ontology that the naturalist doesn't have, because the way this,
yeah,
I mean, this is the single trick that I'm just going to play over and over and over. We must compare the two theories like for like,
yeah,
and and then see if God's doing any work, right? Any
good,
extra
good,
work?
yeah, yeah,
Is there any gain? And going the Leibnizian way is not going to help, right? That's not going to advantage theism.
no,
Right.
good.
So I
That's
should
right.
say,
That's right.
maybe I should say something else at this point. Starting from about 2011, I wrote a bunch of papers in which I gradually kind of worked out this idea as it applies to the why is there something rather than nothing question. So that was what got me thinking about modality and what I wanted. The way that I did it originally was just to argue you've got to compare like with like, right? So think about the naturalist and theistic theories where there's a contingent origin, or where there's a necessary origin, or where there's an infinite regress, or where there's a necessary origin but it's got contingent features.
Hmm.
And if you think about it like that, you compare like for like, theism never looks better, because the thing that's doing all the work is the same in the two theories, and God's there as a kind of extra bit
Hmm.
of ontology, and there's a bunch of extra ideology that goes along as well, right? It just gets way more complicated. Right. Now, what I said in the debate with Bill was, um, given that I've already got that, and I mean, if you really push me, I guess I kind of like the necessary origin view the most, but I'm not actually that wedded to it. But I'm happy to sort of let's run with that.
Yeah.
Well, if we run with that, then that looks like a pretty good view, right, compared to the theistic alternative.
Okay. So here's a question then about that. Right. So um, you might ask whether the way that your picture works is that there's some necessary starting point, let's say singularity, let's say, for lack of a better
Yeah,
word. That's just a placeholder for some
yeah,
necessary
it
starting point,
is.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay. And then as you say, chances play out, right? And um, that's where we get the contingent features of the world, right? Like why this cup is exactly here right now rather than
yeah,
some other location or whatever.
yeah.
That's explained by the not by the features of the necessary singularity at the beginning, but by the kind of dice roll of the chances as they played out
Right.
subsequently, right?
So we can think of causation as always being indeterministic,
Yeah,
maybe. It's just that lots of the probabilities are just minuscule, right? So
yeah, right. Okay,
yeah,
but I wonder whether, I mean, here's another view, right, which is quite similar to that. Let's just say everything's exactly the same as that. But other things that are included in the way that the chances play out is that there's also a bunch of chances for the laws of physics playing out completely differently. That there's some initial series of fundamental
yeah,
chances, right, which set
yeah.
the variables differently. But okay, so if we're allowing that type of thing, then can't I also have an even more expanded view of that, where the applicability of mathematics to the world is one of these things where chance played out differently. Like, why does that have to be
Yeah.
necessary?
Sure, it
Right.
doesn't. And so I should have been a little bit more careful. There's another part of the view after I'd started thinking about why is there something rather than nothing. The next thing I started thinking about was the fine tuning, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what's the difference now? Well, the important thing to think about, and we're going to suppose that there's an origin, is the values of the constants fixed at the beginning or at some later point?
Yeah.
If it's fixed at the beginning, it's necessary. If it's fixed at a later point, it's the result of chance. But if it's fixed at some later point and not earlier, then chance is the right answer, right? So that's actually what I want to say in this case too. I'm not committed to the applicability being necessary. It could also be, just as it is with the fine tuning, another way that, for all we know, it might have gone was it's at some later point that it gets fixed. And I agree 100% about that.
Right. Okay. So it's helpful, I think, for my understanding of the way you look at it, because I think the way you said it in the debate was that it just sort of falls out of the theory that it's necessary.
Yeah,
I
and
think
that's wrong. That's wrong.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's a better way of
but,
putting it is it could fall out of the theory.
Yeah.
On one way of viewing the theory. On another way, it's just not part of the theory at all. It's contingent.
So, because the view is complicated, I sometimes just present it as I'm committed to this one version with the necessary origin and kind of everything being fixed there. But actually, I'm kind of undecided between a bunch of theories. All that I really need in order to argue for the against God is just that you compare like with like, the theistic versions with the naturalistic versions.
Yeah.
And if I'm being really careful, I'm going to make it clear that that's what I'm centrally committed to. Yeah.
Okay, good. So I think now let me try and play devil's advocate, or God's advocate, I suppose should be my way of putting it. So let's compare like for like and compare the version of your theory where it's contingent with the version a bit like Bill's where it's contingent. And you could say, as you did before, well, it's just a tie, right? Because they're basically just equivalent, right? There's, as you said, on your theory, there's some point where chance is played out and mathematics happen to be applicable in exactly this way, to this degree, or whatever. It could have been other degrees. Whatever the degrees of freedom are there, who knows what that is, as you were saying.
Yeah.
But on Bill's theory, supposing the degrees of freedom are the same, God just makes a choice. And you were saying, well, that's just the same, right? Because he's just like, his free choice is equivalent to just throwing a dart at the probability space and just picking one at random or something. But I think obviously he's going to push back there. And I've been thinking of trying to read a bit of Alexander Proust recently, and I find difficult to read, difficult to follow sometimes. But that might just be my being thick or whatever. But he wants to say something about how there's a contrast between a kind of non-reasoned free choice, which is a kind of like blind sort of stumbling around kind of freedom where there's nothing that's guiding it, even though the choices are free, with a kind of reasoned free choice. And I think, but I might be getting this wrong, that the distinction goes back to William James, or somebody like that anyway. And he's saying, look, with the theistic type of free choice here, you've got to talk about like it being a reasoned free choice. Now, there might be problems with that, but what you want to say is something, look, so before the Leibnizian view, the reason kind of dominates the choice completely, just has to pick the best of all possible worlds. But here you might say, well, he has a preference or something, like, and that's his reason, right? He likes worlds where infinite Hilbert spaces can be applied or whatever. And if he has that preference, then, him picking it doesn't seem quite so random anymore. Whereas on your theory, there's no, you can't appeal to this. And that would make a difference, because if that type of appeal to reasons made sense, was theoretically relevant here, then it can't really apply on a theory that doesn't have people making choices for reasons, right? Which feels like what the naturalists can't have, right? They're not going to be able to make up that gap. So I just wondered what you think about that type of appeal to reasons, non-necessitating reasons, I suppose, and whether that can count as an explanation here.
So maybe it can. I mean, and at various places, I've tried to write some stuff about this and think more clearly about it than I've managed to do so far. we're supposing that we're supposing that God's loaded up with these reasons, right, to pick the world where mathematics is effective. But we're supposing there are possible worlds where it's exactly the same as the way he is, and he picks the other world.
Yeah.
How are we supposed to think about that? And what in that other world, what are we supposed to say in explaining his behavior? Because nothing's changed, right? That was the hypothesis. And there are worlds like that, right? And it's not that God's unreasonable in the other world, right?
Right,
I mean,
right.
that's not the explanation. So what's the difference, right? It looks as though it's a bit hard to explain why we got the unreasonably effective mathematics just given the reasons, when there's worlds with exactly the same history where we don't get it. And it's the forking structure with the no difference, but it goes one way or the other. That's the bit that worries me.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
Now,
so
you might say maybe there's a kind of distribution that comes along with this. It's a kind of, and it's not a flat distribution. So there's more likelihood that you'll go this way rather than that. But the likelihood doesn't explain why you get it, right? Because go to the other world where the unlikely thing happens. You can't say that it was because it was unlikely that it happened, right? So there may be something that you can explain in terms of the likelihood, but it doesn't look like it's the occurrence of the thing.
Yeah.
Right? So that's where I am with this. I don't believe what Proust says, but I'm not entirely sure that I've kind of got it all sorted out.
Yeah, right. I feel the same way, right? I feel like it's difficult to get my head around and settle on a view, but I think I have a similar worry, right? Like, I think you're going to say something, or I think he's going to say something like God has reasons in all worlds for whatever he does, right? There's no world where God does something for no reason. So let's make the example clearer. Like, you could say, I made coffee this morning instead of tea, right? And my reason for making coffee is that it like wakes me up better. But if I picked tea, my reason would have been that I like tea. I like the taste of tea more than coffee or something. Yeah. So no matter which one I do, I have a reason that explains why I do that or something. And so you might think, well, there you go, right? Like, that job done, everything's explained. But then I think the worry you were pointing to is you might say, well, why did the coffee reason, why was that the one that motivated you rather than tea, right? Yeah. And that's just to say, why was World One actual rather than World Two, right? It doesn't really, you're just describing things in World One. That doesn't help you. You need to have something else somehow. And so it does. And I'm not explaining that particularly clearly. I'm not sure how I can explain it any more clearly than that. But there's just this sense that there's a can kicking, right? The real question was just sort of put off by this talk about reasons or something.
So I think that the idea that if there's one of these forks and you can't explain why one way rather than the other, that's a deficit in your theory, right? That's a kind of root intuition that I've got. And what someone like Proust eventually wants to do is to deny that intuition, right? And I think that when you're doing your accounting of theories, every time there's one of those forks, you should think of that as a theoretical cost. That's the way that I think about it.
But then you're saying two theories balance out, though, because you've got loads of those forks, but so does
that's right. Yeah, I mean, having the forks is not a problem if there's lots of them out there, right? If we've got libertarian free will, or if quantum mechanics is chancy, then reality is full of these forks. But all of those ones, Craig and I, or Proust and I, whoever we're having this dispute, we'll commit to them all because they're all ones that we've just got independent reason. It's got nothing to do with the dispute between naturalism and theism. But there's this one, right, that we're particularly interested in. And if only one of us has it and the other one doesn't, then that would be a tick for the one that doesn't have it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. On your, but on the like for like theory, because there's basically two versions of your theory when it comes to the applicability of mathematics to the world, right? One of
Yeah.
them where it's just packaged into the way the singularity is, or it's a constraint on what is what chancy things could play out, and one where it's not, right? So if we're comparing apples with apples, like you said, we should compare the two that are most similar to each other. So on the version of your theory where it doesn't fall out, that the world would be that mathematics would be applicable to it, and it's just that's just the outcome of a fork, right? And so that's, as you're saying, a kind of weird deficit, something to complain about theoretically or wonder what the explanation is or something. But then the idea is, well, even if you follow the theist down this rabbit hole of, God's libertarian, free, and he has reasons for his actions, and that kind of does some explaining, you end up finding yourself at an exactly equivalent, theoretically equivalent fork structure, where it's just behind the reasons, there's just this fork, which is why were those reasons motivating rather than the other ones. And that's a brute contingency. And it's a whatever the phrase is, a happy coincidence that God is motivated to make the world have mathematics unusually applicable to it, right?
Yeah. And if you find the one objectionable, you should find the other one objectionable too. It shouldn't satisfy. Yeah.
So it's a kind of sideshow.
Yeah. Yes.
Right. Okay. So it feels to me that, right, that seemed to me the most significant aspect of the debate, right? Which was Craig wanted to say his view was a better explanation than naturalism. And it seems like what's going on there is two types of mistake. One was the naturalist has to have a view according to which it's a lottery, which whether mathematics applies and the extent to which it does. And that's not necessarily the case, right? Because there's other versions of naturalism where that's just a product of the necessary way things had to be. But even if, but then on his favored view of theism, which is kind of Proustian idea of God's free choices, that is effectively just the same. The thing that's problematic about that, it's exactly the same. So, and actually going right back to the argument, the very first premise of that argument was something like, unless God exists, the applicability of mathematics is a what is it? And I'll explain. A happy coincidence.
Yeah.
And actually rewriting that, it's because God exists. the applicability of mathematics is a happy coincidence. So on his theory, it is ultimately in the final analysis a happy coincidence, right?
Yeah, I think so. There is a happy coincidence, right, that stands in his theory kind of, what is it, upstream from the applicability of mathematics. Right. So if you want to be careful, you'll say something like ultimately it's just a happy coincidence. It could have gone differently, and there's nothing that explains why it didn't go differently.
Yeah. So does being upstream help from a theoretical point of view, do you think? Could someone just say, well, look, those couple of steps upstream are explanation that I have that you don't?
So go back to the elephant and the earth, right? Adding the elephant gives you an explanation that the person who's just got the earth doesn't have, right? The earth's supported by the elephant, right? The upstream doesn't help, right? Because you pay a price, there's extra ontology, and you still have the problematic feature. So that's why, at least that's my view, the upstream really doesn't help. It would if we thought of this in a different way. If we thought, okay, elsewhere, we've decisively established that theism is the better theory, right? And we've got all these independent reasons for thinking that God exists. Well, then then it's kind of spoils to the victor or something like that, right? We know which one of these two theories to pick. And so the right explanation is that it's God, right? But that's not how we were thinking about this. At best, we were thinking about this as an independent argument
Yeah.
And without any other information, it's a loss to postulate more things, right? I mean, nothing. There's nothing that I argued that said that it's impossible that impossible in some epistemic or doxastic sense that Bill's right about what the correct explanation is. But this argument and these considerations can't possibly show that that's the right view to hold. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So let me push back a little bit on the. Let me try and see what you think about this anyway. So I might say, here's an example I used with Bill when I was talking to him. So I was asking him what he meant by a partially sufficient reason, right? Because that seems to be the element that's in play when he's talking about how, I mean, we were talking about the guy who's finishing his infinite countdown now, and he says, so I was looking at the bit in his paper responding to yours, where your paper's called like Craig on the Kalam, and his is called like Oppy on the Kalam or something, right? And he says something like sort of like a challenge where he's like saying, Oppy has this section in his book where he goes through principles of sufficient reason, and because of this like modal collapse argument, kind of rules out the strong types of explanation, right? That because of that kind of familiar Van Inwagen style argument. But then, he says that you're a bit more sympathetic to the idea of there being partially sufficient reasons. So it's not clear to me what that means. And I think you say something like the idea is implicit in Craig's work, and let's just pretend we know what he means and carry on without ever really explaining what that means. So I guess I wonder if you take the opportunity to see what you think that means, a partially sufficient reason.
So yes, I'm not sure, but maybe we can think about what sort of principle of sufficient reason you could embrace. So if you think that the laws and the boundary conditions are necessary, and you think that all of the causal transitions are indeterministic, then pick anything and you'll be able to give an explanation for it. But it won't necessarily be the case, and in many cases it won't be the case, that you can explain why you got this thing rather than alternatives, right? So everything has some explanation. Like suppose that at a certain point we can either get A or B as the outcome, call the point we're at X, right? Suppose we get A. Well, an explanation for A is that we had X and the chances played out the way they did.
Yeah, right.
But there's no explanation of why we got A rather than B, right? So strong versions of the principle of sufficient reason are just, you can't have them once you've got chances, once you've got those kinds of forks. But you can have a principle of sufficient reason that says that everything has an explanation so long as you think the laws and the boundary conditions are necessary and everything else is either deterministic or indeterministic, right? It doesn't matter. On Leibniz's view, everything has an explanation. On the assumption, I think maybe you need this as an extra assumption, that you can't explain why things are necessary. I mean, and that you shouldn't worry about the fact that you can't do that. The principle of sufficient reason shouldn't require you to explain why it's necessary that certain things are necessary. So I'm thinking that this partial versus, partial sufficient reason versus sufficient reason has to do with whether you're thinking that you can just ignore forks in formulating your principle of sufficient reason, right? So long as where you've got a fork, you can say, whichever fork we went down, we've got some explanation for the existence of that thing. If we hadn't had the prior thing, we wouldn't have got it at all. Right?
Okay, right. I think that I see. So it seemed to me there was two options, and I think you've gone for one of them, right? So the way you put it was, where you say something like, why did we get A rather than B? And then you say, well, because this is the probabilistic setup, right? And at point X, A and B were both possible, and that's it, right? And
Yeah.
so it's like saying, why did the roulette table show 15 or something? And it's like, well, because you're at the roulette table, and that's one of the things it could show, right? That's why,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
so, and if that's what it means to be a partial explanation, then I think it makes sense. And I talked to Wes Morriston about this. He doesn't like this so much, but it seems to me that if that's the rationale there, then it's if someone says, well, why did the guy finish his infinite countdown now rather than say yesterday or in a million years time or whatever, you can just say something like, well, because the universe is infinitely old, right? And that's equivalent to saying because you're at the roulette table. Because like if the universe is infinitely old, then in a very broad sense, it's always possible that someone's finishing an infinite countdown at any point in time, right? And
Yeah.
if we're just sort of giving these conditions that specify, I mean, you were specifying like probabilities or something, and I'm setting a condition that just gives a broad possibility. But it seems to me it's basically the same answer there, right? If that's what a partially sufficient condition is, then that counts, right? What do you think?
You might be able to put more in there though. Like, suppose he's counting at sort of one number a day, and we ignore difficulties about not being able to do that when we go far enough back into the past. Why did he get to 0 today? Well, he was at 1 yesterday, and he was at 2 the day before, and he was at 3 the day before that. He was always going to finish today.
Right, but then that's not a partial reason. That seems to completely explain it, right? Like so.
I think so. Yeah, that's true. I was just thinking about what's available to explain why he says 0 today, and I guess what I was suggesting. I mean, if it's true that he was always going to finish today, then that's a complete explanation.
Yeah. I was just wondering whether.
Whereas it feels to me a bit like the past infinite doesn't explain why he finished today, but it explains how it could be that someone was finishing counting back down to 0 today.
Yeah.
There's a kind of a necessary condition for it.
Yeah, right, but not sufficient condition. Yeah,
but definitely not sufficient. And I guess sometimes we think that citing necessary conditions can kind of do as a partial explanation, but sometimes we don't, or maybe it's contextual. I mean, there's all this hard stuff about how explanation, especially causal explanation, works, and what's, so why was there an explosion? Because there's oxygen in the air. It doesn't feel great as even though it was a necessary condition for the explosion. Right?
Yeah, or like why did I make coffee this morning? Because the value of the gravitational constant is blah blah blah. Like, I mean, obviously that's not part of an explanation, but it's a necessary condition. I agree. So it becomes a kind of weird contextual question about like which necessary conditions can be parts of explanation. And I guess that leads me back into this thing that I was trying to direct you towards a minute ago, which is like, so what you might say about what necessary conditions can be part of that would be something about clearing up mystery, right? So this might be a way of thinking about what an explanation is. So an explanation doesn't have to entail logically the thing that it explains, but it has to say something that makes it clears up the mystery. And that's a vague term, and it's completely like subject specific. Like what clears up mystery for me might not clear up mystery for you, but let's just run with this idea as intuitive for the time being. Like, so it you might say, well, the problem with stating the value of the gravitational constant is it doesn't help me understand anything about why you made tea rather than coffee, right? But but it just seems to me, and this might just be a sort of idiomatic thing about me, but it does say something. Like if you say, well, why did he finish his countdown today? And I explain something about like, well, if the past was finite, right, this property wouldn't be there. But because it's infinite, that actually opens up this sort of weird avenue of possibilities, which means that like strange stuff like that is kind of like broadly possible now, which it wasn't before. So I'm contrasting, implicitly contrasting something, and that feels like it does clear up some mystery, or at least says something relevant there that feels like it could play that role, right?
It feels like it answers a different question. It answers the question, how could he have counted down to 0 and ended
Yeah.
today, rather than why did he end today? It just feels like it's an answer to a slightly different question. But these causal things are often very sensitive to exactly which question you're asking. What's the right answer to give? Right.
So, but then with the going back to your example, which was what made me think of this, was, you're saying, well, we've got this branching point X, and there's A and B coming off in different directions, and it goes one way, it goes to A rather than B or something, and then the explanation that in that indeterministic setting is just to say something like the probabilistic conditions at A were this, right? And that feels like it's saying that in addition to saying there was a probability attached to A happening, a non-zero or non-one probability of it happening, it's also saying that there was two possibilities, right? And so to the extent that it's doing that, that's the same as what I'm doing here. If time is infinite, there's effectively like always branching points where people are finishing countdowns now, and I'm just sort of referencing those. And so it feels to me that it's sort of structurally quite similar. It's like the structure of possibilities is what's doing some of the work in either of our cases. I don't know. I'm trying to sell this, and I think like you're not buying it. It's okay.
Okay, no. I thought that you were going somewhere slightly different, sort of halfway through that. So, we're at this point. Some event X is happening. We can either get A or B as the event that's caused by X. And when we ask for an explanation, given that we get A of why we got A, the only thing that's there to appeal to is X, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, plus the potential for X to produce either A or B.
Yeah.
Right. So that gives you, that's the kind of case where, at least at a certain point in the past, I wanted to talk about partial explanation. It's not a complete explanation because it doesn't tell you why you got A rather than B, but it does tell you, in some sense, why you got A.
Yeah. Yeah.
How we got from X to A. In your case with the infinite past, if we're asking why did he stop counting today, I'm not sure. Maybe it's analogous that you can say there was an infinite past. I'm not sure that it kind of plays quite the same role that X played in the partial explanation.
Yeah.
So it's not entirely clear to me that the cases are analogous. That's in the right kind of way.
No. I mean, they're not because at best, even if it is analogous, that in some respects it's not analogous, right? Because it's how analogies work. But I think there's a tangential sense in which they're analogous. But I haven't managed to persuade anyone yet about that. So I think either I'm just wrong or I haven't explained the idea or figured out how to say it properly yet. But let me stop this digression for a second. Yeah, it's cool. It's an idea, and I might be going. I often have ideas that go nowhere. I mean, I'm sure you do too. It's part of. You have to be creative. Yeah. So let me just stop this digression, because what I was trying to say was, look, there's two ways that you might have a partial account of partial explanation of something. I mean, one of them is to say, I think as you did, you go back to a certain point where something contingent happens, and all you can do is say, well, I can't tell you why A happened rather than B. I can just say there was some probabilities on either side. Both were possible, and here are the probabilities for each of them happening, and that's it. It's just a story you can tell that goes, but why did the radioactive nucleus decay at exactly this point? There's no explanation exactly why it happened there. It's just it has a half-life or whatever, and that's all you can say about it. Another way of thinking about it, though, which I was trying to direct you towards, was so you might say partial explanation still is one of stronger relationship between the explanation and the thing it explains, but it's one where the chain of explanation just sort of terminates due to either lack of knowledge about how it goes any further or something. And that seems to me it's analogous to it just terminating because there's no explanation at all. But here's an example, right? So why is Bobby Kennedy dead, right? Like you might wonder why that's contingently true and why is it contingently true. And let's just say you have no explanation at all about that. You just don't know anything. And then there's someone else comes along and says, oh, I can explain that, right? He was assassinated, right? So this guy, Sirhan shot him. That's why he's dead. And then someone might ask him, well, why did that happen? And he go, I don't know. I don't know why he did it. It's just, I don't understand his motives or whatever. Now, it feels like I do have an explanation. Like I do know more about what happened and some of the mystery's been removed about it, right? Even though it just went one step further back and then terminated in something just as mysterious as where I started. But having that extra step helped me. So it feels like that's relevantly disanalogous to your elephant thing, right?
Yes.
Where now I feel like that is helping me understand how we got to this point. So I wonder whether, is the theist going to say, well, what's going on when I give this extra step of like saying that God made this choice for the world to have this applicability or whatever, is I'm clearing up some of the mystery, right? Like when someone tells you that Sirhan shot Bobby Kennedy, that helps you understand now, even if you don't know why he did it. So what do you think about that as a kind of pushback?
Right. So I guess the question is about the evidence for the preceding thing. Like you can easily go and check, and there's lots of independent confirmation that Bobby Kennedy was assassinated by Sirhan, right? So, whereas in the other case where I was imagining that the way that the discussion was set up, we had no independent evidence for God. We weren't bringing that into account, right? Because what we were doing was comparing these two hypotheses just with respect to this one particular potential explanandum, right? And I said earlier, it would be a different matter, right? I mean, it would just be spoils to the victor if independently you could show that God exists. Then we would just accept that that was the explanation, right? And that seems to be the kind of right way to compare it to the case that you're giving. Right. I mean, if I just postulated, if I just made up out of thin air the idea that there was an assassin and called him Bobby Kennedy, and called him Sirhan, then that would be more analogous, right? But then I'm postulating this stuff without any other kind of independent reason to do so, just because we need some explanation of why he died.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and I suppose that also what's different about the two cases is that like the explanation terminates because of a lack of further understanding, but we don't suppose that the causal chain actually terminates there. Like,
No.
there is an explanation why Sirhan did what he did, presumably.
And you can keep going back further and further if you can uncover more and more of the causal chain. It's just that often it's very difficult to go very far at all with these things.
Yeah.
Right, I suppose you might look. Yeah, go on.
Well, I was wondering whether is that one way of thinking about what a partial explanation is, though, where it's so let's say the fact we're trying to explain is Bobby Kennedy's dead, right? And the fact we're appealing to explain it is that he was shot, I don't know, in the head by Sirhan, something that like entails his being dead, say. That's a strong explanation, like a sufficient reason.
Yep.
But if that explanation is hanging like the elephant in midair, then we might say that what we've got overall is a partial explanation of Kennedy's death, because my chain doesn't go anywhere, right? And even though each link is an entailment, the links stop without anything grounding that or something, and that's what we mean by partial explanation. Do you think that can make sense as a
I guess if it did, it would kind of turn out that all explanations pretty much are partial. Well, in fact, all explanations are, because we never trace things back to the kind of initial surface, assuming we're naturalists, the initial surface from which everything sprang. So, because we can't look back through the huge expansion that happened a fraction of a second into the universe, and what's behind that is just completely opaque to us, right? So at least at this stage, nobody knows. So
like, I'm thinking if theist
I mean, so it will turn out that every explanation now is a partial explanation, I think. Particularly if it was true that everything traced back to that the data on that initial surface is necessary, right? Because what would complete the explanation would be to get back to the initial surface, to the thing that was necessary, because then there'd be no more steps to make. And I guess if it was brutally contingent, it would too, but then there'd be something maybe something less satisfactory about that, because you're kind of starting from something where you've got no explanation why it's that way rather than some other way it could have been. I don't know.
I mean, if the explanation was an infinite chain of contingent things, each one entailing the next one, then I suppose you could say every explanation is partial. But it's not clear that there's anything that's like the elephant hanging that's not standing on anything, right? There's nothing quite so problematic there. It sort of feels to me like that has a theoretical virtue almost, that it doesn't have that unresting thing.
So, I mean, it is also the case with the Kennedy thing that we know that there's some history, right? We just don't know what it is. We just don't have the details. Whereas the debate that Craig and I were having is partly about whether there's a history of a certain kind or not. Right? I mean, is there just the natural world, or is there some prehistory to that? And that seems to make a big difference when you're thinking about the cases. It might explain a little bit the difference between the way that theists think about it and naturalists think about it, because for the theists, they're sure there is this prehistory.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I'm happy enough with the idea that the thought might. So I think the thought. So the way you put the argument in the debate, which is a very attractive way of setting it out as a dilemma, right? Which was, on the so the complaint was supposed to be on naturalism. It's just a happy coincidence, right? And then you can say, well, on naturalism, it could be a happy coincidence, but there are other versions of naturalism where it's just necessary, right? So take your pick. But then the point is just, what does theism have anything substantially different that makes any relevant distinction there? And then your claim was, well, look, it's either going to be some kind of weird Leibnizian thing where it's just necessary, so then it's just a tie, or it's going to be God's making a free choice, and that's basically the same as a brute contingency. It's just a happy coincidence that he makes that choice or something.
Right.
And I tried to push back saying, well, what about reasoned choices? And I think we both agree that actually on the final analysis there, that's not a significant difference to make. And then the idea was just my last ditch attempt at trying to salvage the theist case here is to say something like, well, even if mine is just the same as yours, but with an additional explanatory step that takes us one step backwards and an explanatory chain that then terminates with God making a free choice that doesn't have an explanation, you might say that extra step was helpful in the way that the Bobby Kennedy example, it seems like that extra step is helpful there. But it feels like it kind of is relevantly disanalogous, right? Like the Kennedy example is one where it's the chain is stopping, but it's really just my knowledge about the chain that's stopping. And if we're talking about chains actually stopping, it doesn't help just that it goes back one step and then stops. Right? That's theoretically equivalent at that point. So I think I'm out of ways of trying to help the theist here. I'm trying to do my job of defending them, but I can't think of anything else. I mean, can you? I mean, how else would you? What are you worried about in theist?
So I mean, what we're thinking about trying to defend, though, is just Craig's claim that there's some advantage to theism on this particular point.
Yeah.
And lots of theists are not going to think that. I mean, anyway, right?
Yeah.
Partly because it's not clear that the point's right in the first place, right? It's not clear that there is this bizarre, strange, happy coincidence that needs explaining, right? And I mean, there's a lot more to say about that, but it doesn't look like people who are interested in the debate between naturalists and theists will be particularly interested in exploring it. It looks like that's kind of for philosophers of mathematics and physics or whatever to argue over, because it doesn't seem as though it matters, right? The argument looks like it's not going to be a good argument. Anyway, I think that theists, by and large, can just shrug their shoulders and think, well, okay, so that was not a particularly good argument. Doesn't make that much difference overall. It's not like I was arguing that there's a big advantage here to naturalism, because it all depends, as I said in the debate, on all the other considerations for God and whether you think they win or not.
Yeah.
So that's my view on it. I mean, it could, if somebody, Proust or somebody else, produces kind of really good reasons for thinking that actually there is an explanatory advantage here for theism, that would be a different matter. But I actually don't think I'd be losing too much sleep over that one. There's other things that you might spend more time wondering about than that.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right. Well, I think it feels like it's a reasonably natural place to wind up, but I wondered if last time the problem with the last debate was that there wasn't enough time to focus on the things that seemed the most interesting or the most significant. And this is supposed to be a debate review, or a strange type of review, just been talking about things around it. I guess that's probably more interesting anyway. But was there any thoughts that you wanted to give about how the debate went, or anything you felt like you wanted to say that you didn't say so far?
So, I mean, in preparation for talking to you, I went and watched the debate. I've never done that before. I've never watched any of the videos that I've made. And then I read a lot of the comments as well, which was
a big mistake.
Well, no, it was quite interesting. I think that, as I said much earlier, that we probably made mistakes in the way we set it up. If we wanted to just discuss the argument, we should have just discussed the argument and forgotten about Figner, because it made it weirdly disjointed, and it made it hard. I think it made it hard for Bill to do, like, he was getting tired by the time the two objections that really mattered came on the scene. It would have been much better if we'd started there and the progression and had gone on from there, I think. So it was, I don't know, it was, we may do another discussion, and I expect that if we do, we'll try to structure it differently and try to have it focused on the things that the audience wants us to be talking about, rather than the kind of, we weren't really sure what we were doing approach that we had this time. Yeah.
Well, that would be cool. I mean, I think people would want to see you to talk about the Kalam, but I kind of got the impression at the beginning that you guys had ruled out having that conversation.
So we discussed that. So that was, I'm pretty sure that was Cameron's first suggestion, and we both sort of thought, we've talked about that a lot. So in print.
In print, yeah. Have you talked about it in person?
No, we haven't. Well, this is the first time that we've had a public discussion. So, because I steer away from debates, and debates are what Bill likes to do, right? The big sort of performance things. I much prefer just conversations. Where you can go backwards and forwards and try out ideas and all kinds of, and so on. So we might go again. It depends. It'll depend how Bill feels about it, I think, if he wants to or not.
Well, what would you be interested in talking to him about again if you did.
So we'll have to think about that. And maybe there's some aspect of the Kalam discussion, because it's huge. It goes over so many things. Maybe there's something that we could talk about in there where we feel that it's not really exhausted yet. And it was hard to think about what to talk about. So as I think I mentioned this before, my original suggestion was that maybe we should talk about abstract objects. But the difficulty with that is probably that we agree too much for it to be an interesting discussion.
Yeah.
And it could be tied to, questions about God as well. It's just that, if there were Platonic objects, would that be a threat to divine aseity or whatever? But it's probably too arcane to. I'm not sure.
Well, it might be, but it would also be. I don't think you guys would necessarily disagree with that. I guess if Craig was going to talk to someone about that, he should talk to Van Ingwagen or someone who's a Platonist,
that's right.
who
Yes,
thinks
that's
a
right.
different thing to him.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's right. So I suppose the thing that you need to find is, if you were going to talk to him again, something where you violently disagree, and he thinks whatever it is that you disagree about proves that God exists and you don't. That would be a good topic.
Yeah. Well, this might have been such a case. It's just that the discussion didn't quite get off on the right track, because we both he came with a formulation of Wigner's argument, which I wasn't expecting, but he had a formulation of it. And so then I wanted to talk about that. And I had spent quite a lot of time thinking about the Wigner piece in the day or two before the debate. So I was kind of primed to talk about that as well.
Maybe talking to him about the argument from contingency or something, so that then you can talk about, because it feels like really where the rubber hit the road was about explanation, contingency, and how those, modality, I guess, in general, and how those two theories kind of fare on that territory. All the math stuff was kind of just preamble, it seems to me.
Yeah. So I think that's right. And that will just then go to, that will certainly focus attention on the kind of things that we talked about in the first, hour or so of our discussion about what's the right theory of modality, and whether naturalists can just say that the initial singularity exists of necessity, right? Things like that. Yeah. So that
he actually pulled out the that takes more faith to believe in than God move, which is a cliche card to play.
Yeah, and it was, I don't know, I think it was because it was rushed at that point. But maybe it's not. Maybe it'll be interesting. He did make that remark about it kind of being definitional, that God's worthy of worship, which was a interesting thing to say, which made me think that he was going to try to argue that he could explain God's necessity in terms of something else. Like, Brian Leftow has an enormous book in which he relies a lot on the idea that you can explain some necessities in terms of other necessities, and maybe Craig's going to go down that path. So there would be stuff to talk about.
Yeah, actually, it's reminded me I was going to ask you about that. So you've said, and I mean, I'm not clear what I think here, but so if you say something like, look, why is it the case? Why is it the case that A or something?
Yeah.
Obviously, if A is contingent, that makes perfect sense, and you want to find an explanation for why it's the case, right? But if A is necessary, so I think there's sort of two different ways of understanding some of the things you've said about that. One of them would be something like saying that A is necessary is an explanation for why it's true that A. And the other one is to say something like, there's no explanation of why A is necessary, because things that are necessary don't have explanations. And I guess maybe both of those things are compatible.
I think they're compatible because I do say both of them,
Yeah,
but I'm much more confident about if it's necessary that you can appeal to that to explain why Why
yeah,
is this the case? Because it has to be. Not everything's like that. Sometimes to explain why something's the case, you've got to appeal to something else that it depends on. But
yeah,
if it just has to be the case, there's not much point looking for any other explanations, right? I mean,
yeah,
what could any other explanation look like given? So when why are 2 and 2 4, right, is kind of a bit mind numbing. It's hard to, right? Apart from saying, well, it just has to be, it's hard to say what you can say. I mean, what you can do maybe is find some other things that are necessary and their necessity entails the necessity of this thing. But
yeah,
that's not going to be explanation, I don't think. And in particular, saying, oh, I've got these axioms and this is a theorem. So, the necessity of this one is explained by the necessity of these, because the distinction between axioms and theorems is completely arbitrary. And this goes back to Russell in the Principles of Mathematics, right? We pick the axioms we do because they prove the theorems that we want, right? So you can't explain the necessity of the theorem in terms of the necessity of the axioms, even though the necessity of the axioms entails the necessity of the theorem. And so I don't dispute that there are lots of cases where you can show that the necessity of some things entails the necessity of other things. I just don't think that you can explain why they're necessary.
you can't explain why they're necessary. Yeah,
That's the view. That's the view, right? Because I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's why are 2 and 2 4, or why can't something be red all over and green all over at the same time, assuming that you think that's necessary,
yeah,
right? You can't explain why it's necessary. What you can do is point to other things whose necessity entails its necessity. That's my claim. I'm not sure this is right, but that's the claim.
yeah. Right. So
I'm
I'm
worried.
wondering
I'm
whether
worried that it's not right, but I'm still running with it.
yeah, I know where you're coming from, because I sort of feel similar about it. Feels kind of right, but I mean, I worry about, like, well, isn't a proof explanatory in some way? Like,
Yes,
it's not when
so
you,
in mathematics, for
yeah,
example, um, there's lots of examples where you think, sometimes you think a proof's not explanatory, and sometimes you think it is.
okay,
Um,
yeah, fair.
uh, and
Okay, like the four color proof was one that
yeah,
you brought up.
yes,
And that's one where it's not very explanatory because it's just an
yes,
exhaustion of cases or whatever.
yeah,
But
yes.
there are other proofs where you can show that something, um, that where you gain an insight into why something's true via the
It
proof.
it
And that
it
feels like it's
it
clearing up
feels
mystery,
it feels like it. Yeah, I agree. Yeah,
right? And there are things where just because it's necessary doesn't mean, take the distribution of the primes, right? Like, that looks random, right? It doesn't, there's no pattern, no discernible pattern, it seems to me. I mean, I know why, but I mean, I can explain why each one of them is prime, but
yeah.
I can't, like, predict where the next one's going to be or whatever, and I can't, like, draw a nice looking, like, graph or something that like captures their distribution very well. So it feels like there's something to be explained there. And if I had a more simple way of doing it, a more beautiful way of doing it or something,
Yeah,
then that would give me an explanation, I feel like. And at the moment, it seems like it lacks. And just saying, well, that's necessary. I mean, all
yeah,
mathematical truths are necessary, right? But they're sort of missing the point, right? Like,
yeah,
the distribution of the even numbers doesn't cry out for this, but the distribution of the primes does, right? Like then, so it feels like I could give an explanation here, or that even that one might be needed, even though they're both equally necessary.
yeah,
I don't know.
yeah.
This is what I'm worrying about.
Right. And my temptation is to say, well, in some cases, it's pretty easy to find some other things whose necessity entails this the necessity of this claim. In other cases, it's very difficult to do that.
Yeah.
And mathematics is all about logical consequence, right? What you can prove.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's what I mean when I'm talking about entailment. I'm talking about logical consequence. I'm not thinking about it in a metaphysical way, not in this kind of context anyway.
Yeah, right. And obviously in that, well, I think obviously the choice of axioms is arbitrary, and so what counts as a theorem and what counts as an axiom is completely arbitrary, and there's nothing. I completely agree, obviously, with that. I guess my thought was, I'm not sure it's metaphysical, maybe it is, but I think it's more epistemic, really. It's just that, like, I happen to be better acquainted with some features of mathematical structure, and they seem easier for me to grasp. Basic points about like natural numbers or whatever, the arithmetic or whatever. But then there's some weird consequences that follow from them, like prime numbers or whatever, and that's puzzling to me. And I feel like my natural inclination, maybe this is just my epistemic faculty or something, is to describe those what I'm calling secondary features in terms of those ones that I grasp epistemically more directly. So I'm not sure this is metaphysical. Maybe it is. Maybe that's why I have that access.
I suspect it's not, but yeah.
Anyway, okay. We've been going on for an hour and a half. I don't want to keep you too long, and I need to get ready for work because it's just gone 8 o'clock in the morning here.
Right. So you were up exceptionally early to do this.
It was an experiment.
I'm about to go and cook dinner. So
yeah, I'm going to jump in the shower and put a shirt on. Yeah. So anyways, it's been fun, really enjoyable conversation. So thanks very much.
Yeah, really interesting. So thanks.
Cool. All right. Well, look, I'll be in touch.